Hello and welcome to the News Pace podcast. I'm your host, Johnny Vedmore, and I'm here with someone who I enjoy talking to all the time. John Klyczek is a college teacher, a researcher, a writer. He's been a contributor to loads of different independent media platforms like New Politics, Unlimited Hangout, Op-Ed News, Dissident Voice, and many others. He's a published author. So he has a book called School World Order, The Technocratic Globalization of Corporatized Education, which is published on Trine Day Books. But not only that, he can kick your ass because he's also a certified kickboxing instructor. You can find him at www.schoolworldorder.info and on Twitter at Professor Taoist. But some of his enthralling work, for me at least, it focuses on eugenics, transhumanism, and the brave new world order, which is approaching us like a runaway juggernaut. One thing I can definitely add on a personal note, like I say, we've talked plenty of times off camera, never talked on camera, but we've put in the hours of having conversations over the past year. And one thing I can add to his bio is his character, nature, and morals are impeccable. He's a very good man. And if you haven't already been introduced to his work, well, he is brilliant. So, Klyczek, John Klyczek, please, welcome to Newspace Podcast. Really happy to have you here.
Very happy to be here, Johnny. Very cool.
Awesome. Well, for a lot of people, if some people don't actually know your work, how would you describe your work to other people?
Largely I focus on education and in particular on education technology. So my work builds largely on the work of Charlotte Thompson Iserbyt. She wrote The Deliberate Dumbing Down of America. She worked for the Department of Education under Ronald Reagan. Blew the whistle on something called Project BEST, that's Basic Education Skills Through Technology, which was a government project to set up public-private partnerships with big technology corporations that would use computers, in particular operant conditioning algorithms to condition students for workforce training. And so I've basically taken that work and updated it and plugged it into the Great Reset in the Fourth Industrial Revolution and sort of shown how it's all built towards the crescendo that we're seeing in this new normal.
Yeah, two questions there. I got two questions. Number one, Charlotte's obviously been important in your life. So, you know, a little bit more about her would be very interesting to find out. But also, I take it the road from where her work was and the Reagan era is basically the same path that we've been on and we are still on towards global educational infrastructure and its installation. Is that right?
Yeah. So as far as there was a few departments that she was put in, or offices rather, she was Office of Educational Research and Improvement. And when she got hired, the Assistant Secretary of Education, name was Donald Sinise. And he said that, or she told me the story was when she got hired, she asked him, "Are you going to be loyal?" And she said, well, you know, I figured that what he meant was, am I going to be loyal to the Constitution? So I said, of course. She said, you know, I was pretty sure that he meant, was I going to be loyal to Ronald Reagan? And so, you know, she spent most of her time digging.
And then what does that mean? Does that mean you're actually loyal to George H.W. Bush and his guys? Anyway, go on. Sorry.
Yeah. I mean, he was, you know, you remember that Reagan, he ran on the whole, he wasn't going to have any trilaterals in his administration. He wasn't going to have any CFR. Of course, he obviously did. But, you know, more sinister would be the fact that George H.W. Bush was also a member of the Order of Skull and Bones. And for those that don't know, the reason why we even know what we know about the Order of Skull and Bones is because Charlotte Iserbyt leaked the address books or the catalogs. Her father and her grandfather were both members of the Order of Skull and Bones. And in the 80s, Anthony C. Sutton, who wrote America's Secret Establishment, Introduction to the Order of Skull and Bones, he had been working for the Hoover Institute and he wrote a series called Western Technology and Soviet Economic Development. And there's 3 volumes, and basically what he found was that the United States had been funding the Soviet Union to the extent that they wouldn't have been quite the formidable adversaries that they became. When he went to publish the 3rd volume, they basically said, the phrase was, "Don't break your rice bowl, Anthony," meaning, if you publish this, you're going to be persona non grata in academia. But he did it anyways, and as a result, he basically had his academic career ruined. And so he wanted to know, who were the men behind the curtain? Who did I upset by publishing this? And his research eventually led him around to Trilateral Commission, but also to the Order of Skull and Bones. He contacted Charlotte. Charlotte gave him, I'm trying to get up and grab them. Here they are. These are the catalogs here. And there's 3 of them.
And lovely for the people who can't see this, is the lovely look like they were black. Are they leather bound? They feel good. They look good. No.
But these were like the special edition because they typically didn't bind them in this way. I remember that her dad, when they got them that year, it was a special packaging here, and so she gave him that. And basically, what he found was that a lot of the people that popped up in his research on the Hoover series were members of the Order of Skull and Bones, and he also discovered that they had also funded both sides of the war. So they didn't just fund the Soviets; they also funded the Nazis. The infamous example was the Union banking regime. And then, a couple of generations later, or rather 1 generation later, HW, two generations is George W., but HW becomes eventually the head of the CIA. He was also the ambassador to China under Nixon, and then becomes vice president with Reagan. And when Charlotte's in the education, research, and improvement, but as she was digging around and finding things that they sort of making a mess of operations, they would move her from one office to the next. So they moved her from everywhere from there to public-private partnerships, which would become school choice, which becomes the whole charter school, the private funding of public education, using public tax dollars to privatize or to subsidize private corporations. And so, that part of it, and then also the offices of in the technology initiatives, those sort of keep going, and they continue their momentum, whether it's a left wing or a right wing administration. So you get the public private partnerships started in Reagan. Around that time, you had the head of the AFT, American Federation of Teachers. That would have been Albert Shanker. He came up with the idea of charter schools. But then Clinton, right, Democrat, he actually signed into legislation the first federal charter school law. And then the Obama administration was a huge proponent of charter schools. It got probably the biggest push that it got under Obama. He actually, his Secretary of Education was Arne Duncan, and Arne Duncan, he made a name for himself by basically boosting the whole charter school industry in Chicago through the Noble Network of Charter Schools and through KIPS, Knowledge is Power program. And then, you move to the Trump era, and you have Betsy DeVos, all about school choice. So it's the Reagan project, which was best encapsulated in Project Best.
She was a really strange one.
Steady momentum.
Betsy DeVos was a really strange one, if I remember correctly. I mean, she didn't seem to have any sort of experience. She was brought in just for that sort of. Am I thinking of the right person?
Yeah, well, yeah, she has no background in education, right? She doesn't have a degree in education.
She seemed completely. She seemed like she hasn't been to school. She seemed basically stupid.
Well, she's got a lot of money. So if you got money, you can do a lot with that money that you don't need a whole lot of academic credentials for it. So I
True.
guess it wasn't. So she was a big financer of charter schools. So she funded, in particular, K-12 Inc. K-12 Inc. was the first virtual charter school. It was. I think it still is the largest virtual charter school in the United States.
Can you explain to people what charter schools are, just to understand?
Yeah. So in the United States, our education system, there's a public system and a private system. And private education, obviously you have to pay tuition out of pocket. Okay, and it's traditionally hasn't gotten any subsidies from the tax dollars, whether federal or state. Public education is always funded publicly, so it's gone through different phases. Early on, it was largely through property taxes, and then when they developed state boards of education, they started to build. And then with the development of the Every Student Succeeds Act, the second iteration. The first would have been Elementary and Secondary Education Act, and then different versions of those, basically the federal legislation governing the budgeting and policy for public education. So what charter schools are they're basically public-private partnerships. So you have private companies that are able to use public tax dollars. So basically,
were these public-private partnerships? Were they? Was that the first time they were introduced under Reagan, or had they already been doing this beforehand? Because I know that that's what we experienced under New Labour, is them pushing this agenda completely upon us. But that's like 20 years later.
Yeah, I was going to say the corollary is, to my understanding, and I haven't done a super deep research into the British education system, but I believe you have something called, so you have a series of schools called academies, and those include like free schools, and there's a couple others, right? And those I believe are comparable to charter schools, right?
Right. Okay. Yeah.
They are created by trusts, and these trusts are basically funded. They're essentially like nonprofit corporations, basically.
Yeah.
And as far as so the concept of charter schools starts in the United States starts early '80s with Albert Shanker, who actually was a member of the Trilateral Commission. But in some ways, the idea precedes it. There's a document I have somewhere around here that Charlotte gave me, where the concept actually can be traced back to Vichy, France. One of these days, I'm going to dig that up.
Under the Vichy French section somewhere.
I have stacks. Well, I got several folders that say school choice on them. I mean, and it's in one of those folders. But so that's probably one of the earliest iterations. But if you read Brzezinski's Between Two Ages, the subtitle something about the Technocratic era. This is mid-late 70s. He actually talks about what is now the Fourth Industrial Revolution, but he talks about this technotronic revolution, and he describes how education will sort of evolve into he doesn't use the term charter schools or public-private partnerships, but what he says is that business will take a leading role in education, which is essentially that's the project. And in particular, what they'll do is they'll facilitate technotronic education. So they use computers to facilitate the learning, and largely what he promoted was through the home. So there's a big homeschooling movement that's arisen to sort of resist all the crazy stuff that goes on in schools now. And what a lot of people inadvertently are falling into the trap of is that they're basically signing up for these virtual charter schools. So what you're doing is you're taking in a private company into your house. and essentially the federal government as well, because right, in order to be accredited and to receive the federal tax dollars, they have to abide by the federal standards and curriculums. So you're really just taking the school system and you're basically bringing it into your home and subsidizing it not only with your tax dollars but with your home infrastructure. But so that idea, like I said, we could probably trace it back to Vichy France, earlier or later early iterations, conceptualized by Brzezinski, and then the project itself sort of gets weight behind it when Schenker comes up with the idea, and then the Reagan administration starts to give it the federal backing.
It's very interesting. You got this pseudo-nationalist sort of history to all of this. It's like, I say pseudo-nationalist because, of course, Vichy France was very much down with the Nazis as soon as they come around. And I lived down in the south of France where they really, really had a strong base. And I can see why. It's pretty obvious. There is a lot of what I'd say racism, of course, is subjective to where you are and relative to where you are and what the people within your culture believe is racism. But down there, I mean, they were pretty racist. I mean, it was quite fantastic to hear some of their rhetoric and be like, wow, they think this is normal. I come from a place where everybody just gets on with each other. You can't keep having arguments about race all the time when all your next door neighbors are from other countries. You have to find some form of common ground, And living in the cities in places like Britain and America, that's what you have. You have a lot of mixed race sort of feeling in all of the cities. Out in the country, it's a little bit different. But down in France, it's really like in that area, it's a really stark difference between the haves and have-nots and their skin color and ancestry. So I lived in Lyon on Avenue Franklin Roosevelt. And on Avenue Franklin Roosevelt, everybody was basically white. And then on either side with the banlieues, the like sort of suburbs where all of the black people and Arabic people were in these really big high-rise tower blocks, and they were just, they have their own life and they don't interact. And there's a whole two different ways of living form, and there's a lot of there's a massive disparity. And so I'm not surprised that something like this comes from that sort of area where you can have this sort of where capitalism and democracy meets fascism and dictatorship, really. Those sort of places seem to be where a lot of this sort of ideology originated from, in those sort of melting pots. So not surprised to hear that. Really interesting. I mean, in every country now, we're getting basically the same sort of offer from our governments about schooling. We don't have much say. It's all going in a certain direction, and basically they say this is the direction we've got to go, so we have no alternative. Was there ever an alternative, or were they all on board from around the 80s with this agenda?
So there was always a homeschooling movement, going
chin again.
And so you could say that's, I mean, if there's any sort of resistance, I mean, there's kind of a dialectical game that's played, all right? So I see the United States education system in like three broad phases. So the first one is the compulsory education phase, which started in mid-1800s with Horace Mann at Antioch College. And followed by that was a period of federalization that was sort of buttressed by large foundation funding. So the Rockefeller General Education Board, there was a Peabody nonprofit as well that was really big in the early phases. But then shortly thereafter, you'd had your Carnegie Corporation, your Carnegie Institute for the Advancement of Teaching, Ford Foundation.
I seen the German Marshall Fund. When I was researching the German Marshall Fund, I seen them doing the same thing in the same area during the 1970s, late 70s, going on 80s as well.
Okay. Okay.
A
Yeah.
lot of
Yeah.
the members, a lot of the people who were on the board. I mean, the German Marshall Fund was the first, but the advisory board was David Rockefeller, John J. McCloy, and all of the CFR gang, and they were basically pushing the same sort of things. But that was really a place to study the impact and come up with some of the ideology with some of the movers and shakers
Yeah.
of the grand scene.
Yeah. Well, the 70s is an interesting period because you have so in '68 you have the Club of Rome is set up, and then in '70 you have the World Economic Forum, and then I want to say '72 or '73 you have the Trilateral Commission. All right, and I think it was the third annual meeting of the World Economic Forum was the one where Aurelio Pecci was the head of the one of the co-founders of the Club of Rome. He basically pitched the limits to growth thesis to the World Economic Forum. And also at that same annual meeting, this was the same annual meeting where Klaus Schwab pitched his idea for stakeholder capitalism, which he had just developed a couple years prior to that. Stakeholder capitalism.
I think that's a bit like the story behind that. I think that was the whole ideology was kind of given to him by the people within Harvard, and he became the face of it. But that's just my own like research on that. Go on.
Yeah, well, I mean, what you see though is like with something like what Brzezinski is pitching, right? He was basically a co-founder of the Trilateral Commission with David Rockefeller, right? This idea of these public-private partnerships using technology at a global scale, right? I mean, this is essentially the stakeholder capitalism project, right? And Klaus Schwab in the book that he did something about European management of industries or something was the book where the concept kind of comes out of. But it's not too long after that you start to see the word stakeholder, right? In these executive orders or in public legislation, whether federal, state, or local, and you start to see the companies using this stakeholder language. And so this is also sort of the precursor to somebody like Schenker, right, coming up with this project for school choice, right? So all of that is sort of what we're seeing now in this new the communitarian / public-private stakeholder capitalism, which is basically just a combination of corporate fascism, basically the fascist economics or using the cartel model of fascist economics and sort of blending it with this communitarian ethos that sort of piggybacks on some of the Marxist ethos of basically like a welfare state, right? So in other words, these fascistic public-private partnerships are to be used to facilitate sort of what the American version of the Marxist system, which became the social democratic welfare state, right? And so these giant multinational companies are gonna take care of the serfs, so to speak, with various the welfare programs, and it sort of gets a new flavor in the 21st century with the rise of critical theory and cultural studies. And so the whole dialectic or the whole class dynamic of the bourgeois and the proletariat sort of becomes bifurcated or fragmented into sort of the dialectic between the various race, class, gender, sexual identity, all these different marginalized groups. And so through these stakeholder public-private partnerships that use their ESG and social impact financing, that the projects or the ethos behind that is not just that they're going to help subsidize the poor, but they're going to help uplift all these different marginalized identity groups. Okay. And so, so this Great Reset project, right, is at least as old as the early 70s.
I completely agree. Concur. I know some people would have been saying, "Oh, it's 1971 was the first World Economic Forum," but through 1970, they were planning that out. That's when John Kenneth Galbraith and Herman Kahn came to Europe, along with Otto von Habsburg, to convince people that the project was worthwhile and that they should get on board. And like the first year was a success. Second year, like 1971, it was January 1971. So, you know, a lot of that was organized throughout 1970. Then 1971, you got the first one. 1972, you got a dip. 1973, you got Aurelio Petri standing up on the stage and saying some of the things that you're not allowed to say. And, you know, everybody got excited. And it was, I've documented in my work that Herman Kahn's response to that, the man who wrote On Thermonuclear War, was considered the real Dr. Strangelove, but really that's a character, which is an amalgamation of a load of different people at the time, very famous people. But Herman Kahn, he was like devastated by the Club of Rome's view of the world and this new like neo-Malthusian like cult that suddenly took over everything. And I think that sort of ideology mixed in with this stakeholder capitalism to appear at the same time like that, it's obviously a symbiotic relationship. I think they came from the same place. So I think Klaus Schwab became the front for that. And then what you see through the 70s, like the 70s is so interesting, is them pushing environmentalism and education. That's the two main things. We hide behind the cover of environmentalism, grow up like an NGO and foundation structure and non-governmental organization structure that's linked to the intelligence apparatus at the same time. But really just every time that we want to achieve something like a coup in the future, like by the late 80s and early 90s, as the color revolutions were starting in Europe, what you started to see was them hiding behind environmental movements. And then the first thing they do is change education. You know, they knew what you need to get into being able to write the rules for the next generation if you're going to take over the country within 10, 20 years. And that's what they do. They go in at education. That's one of the most important parts of everything. That's partly why I think it's so important that the destination of where the World Economic Forum led to be with the Global Leaders for Tomorrow and the Young Global Leaders program. It's still all about education. It may not be about educating children anymore, but it's about educating leadership groups, which is much more important because then that obviously trickles down. So all of that period is just astounding. Right. Oh,
yeah.
So go on.
Oh, go for it.
No, I want you please.
I was just going to say that, yeah, I mean, so, you know, when people think sustainable development goals, they usually think that it's, you know, green energy and, you know, clean energy and all sorts of other green technologies, right? Carbon sequestration and things like that. But if you actually look at the 17 goals, they actually come out of what was called the Millennium Development Goals, right? So the term prior, right, did not have the narrow connotation of basically the green movement, right? It had a broader, you know, futurist approach to all aspects of society, all aspects of the global economy, all aspects of international relations, so education, you know, poverty reduction. But basically, the SDGs, they are basically the same as the MDGs. There's a couple more. One of the original MDGs was sustainable development. So they just took that one and they sort of made that the umbrella term. Mm-hmm. But if you look at like SDG number 4, that's quality education. SDG number 17 is partnerships for the goals. In particular, SDG 4.4, what they emphasize is polytechnical workforce training. SDG 4.7 is basically emphasizes global citizenship. And then SDG 4.B emphasizes the expansion of global IT technologies and STEM education. And then if you look at SDG 17, 17.16 emphasizes multi-stakeholder partnerships. So the stakeholder capitalist language is cooked right into the SDG number 17. And then within that, SDG 17.6 is increased access to global technology. 17.8 is enhance the use of IT and other technologies, and then 17.17 emphasizes public-private partnerships, which, right, the idea of public-private partnerships and a stakeholder approach is basically just saying that, instead of the shareholders, right, so you have the people that run the company and then the people that are invested in it, and sort of the dance between those two. The public-private partnerships with these other stakeholders would be what they call community-based or organizations, right? And those could be everything from your trade unions or to your employees to your schools, right? And so from the get-go, the two, right? They don't just happen to come together at the end, right? I mean, they start at the same place, they're pitched at the same place by essentially the same people.
Suspicious.
So it's effectively it's all part of the same agenda, right? It's always been that way.
Yeah, most definitely. And we're right. We're heading towards this now. We've gone through. You've just given us a little rundown, and we've given a taste of what was going on. Late 60s, all through the 70s. Then, of course, we've also talked about some of what was going on in the 80s and how we got here. And we were talking about it. There is big similarities between the UK government's approach under New Labour and Tony Blair to what you've described to us about public-private partnerships and charter schools in America. So I think across the world, everybody can connect with this. And it all seems to sound like a way to infiltrate places you don't want too much private messing around. You don't really want your private corporations to be involved in your schools or what your children are learning and all of these things, because where that ends is going to be negative. So obviously all of these structures are set up to mean that we have no option. You have to choose one of these models that includes doing the thing you don't want to do, which is allowing whatever service that you find important to be infiltrated by the private sector somehow. So it's constantly making holes within the public sector for the private sector to enter, and those, it's really hard then to extricate that when it's around everywhere and it's a part of everything. How do you take it out of society? So we've hit. So say we're hitting the 90s. What is the 90s and noughties? How is this progression? How has this progressed throughout that period then, in America mainly?
Oh, the 90s. I mean, that's largely when I grew up. It's that particular decade is not one that I can really, where anything really jumps out at me in particular.
What was your schooling like?
I don't remember much about schooling because I wasn't really paying much attention. I didn't do very good in school. I was basically, they said I was smart or whatever. I guess I was smart enough. Like they wanted most classes, but I got kicked out of those and then was let back in eventually. But I was mainly tried to figure out what was the quickest way to get a C. How could I cut enough corners?
Clever.
Kind of get by. I was pretty much a class clown and stuff like that. So I didn't read any. I think the only thing I ever read that was assigned to me was I don't think I read the whole thing, but I read a lot of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein because I happened to be suspended for like a week, and
the irony.
So I would I'd go and get home before the suspension letter got home, and then I'd take it out of the mail, and then go to the bus stop. Pretend like I'm going to school, and then when the bus came, I just at the park and read Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. But most of what I read on my own was, I read the whole Old Testament. I read, Four Noble Truths, a lot of Buddhist sutras, and I read, studied the I Ching quite a bit. I read a lot of Edgar Cayce. I was into a lot of esoteric, religion, philosophy, mysticism, and all that type of stuff. And that's that's sort of, I guess, I took some time off, high school and college, did some construction work. And by the time I went to college, it was just kind of like, for the most part, I at that point, I realized that I'd had to have a different approach. So I pretty much just, you know, uh, did my best to get the grades. I still wasn't really engaged in the curriculum in that way. You know what I mean? Like I've always been interested in most of the education, I guess, that I've cultivated has been not through academia, even though I've been in academia my whole life, I guess, which is kind of a strange thing to say. The best things I'd say I got from academia was learning their discourse, right? In other words, learning, like the jargon and the specialized, technical language they use to mark that they are in that circle, that they know what they're talking about. They have some authoritative position on their analysis, and then just the citation system, right? In other words, and how to Boolean search and database and whatnot. So I try to take that approach and apply it to the conspiracy theory. I mean, most of the crypto politics reach that is academia, an academic approach, But as far as me in grade school and in high school, it was school was not on my list of priorities.
I do like how the only time your line broke up during that period was when you said conspiracy theorist. And then it broke up for a little bit. Just seemed like, well, isn't that it gets more, it's the universe. But yeah, I feel akin. This is why I think we kind of get on. Go on, sorry.
I was just gonna say, I mean, what did pop up to me? So in the '90s would have been, so that would have been the Clinton era. So that would have been when he passed I forget the name of the bill, but it was something like the Federal Charter Schooling Act or the Public Charter Schools Act or something like that. There was two versions of it. He signed one and then early on, and then one shortly thereafter. So that's one of the things that would have popped out to me as far as education. But H.W. Bush's administration would have been early '90s as well, and it wasn't not a nation at risk. That would have been in the '80s with Bell and Reagan, but there was something sort of that built on that. It starts with an N, but it escapes me. But those are the two things that I can sort of that pop out to me as far as
Yeah. Yeah, man, that's a weird period to think back on and look back on. But there was a lot going on in Clinton's administration. Straight away, it brought in some big guys. I remember I wrote a piece for UK Column, which was about David Shaw, D.E. Shaw, which was a big hedge fund. Eventually, they'd become, during around that time, in actual fact, they were 5% of the overall New York Stock Exchange. So they obviously, their investments had a bit of sway. And before even Clinton got into office, David Shaw was writing white papers for him on the use of technology, because he saw the internet coming a mile off, but the use of technology within different institutions. So I'm sure he would have been involved in some of that. And it's a period where there was lots of activity going on in every single part. I think that was the '90s was a period where our world started to be designed by intelligence agencies behind closed doors and incorporated into policy institutes that were becoming more global leaning as the whole East-West dynamic was breaking down. So I'm pretty positive that we would have had similar experiences, especially in school. By the sounds of it, we were both class clowns and very, very naughty boys. And the difference being, you were trying to get the grades. I didn't get the grades at all. I was terrible in school. I couldn't help it. I was so just like wanted to play football all the time. That's all. I wanted to play football all the time. Anyway, and smoke weed. And so anyway, I mean, your experience of school, you've gone through that. You go into university. What were you studying at university then? What led you to going back into school?
Oh, I think I just was, and it's funny because I look back and I go like, maybe I should have just stayed swinging a hammer, man, because it's, academia certainly. I'm an adjunct professor. I don't know if they have something comparable over there, but so for those that don't know, an adjunct is somebody who's hired per course per semester, no benefits, no office, no tenure track, right? So it's just sort of if you think of academia like any other company, right? You sort of have like the owner, right? Maybe the regional director is way up there, and then like in the actual building, right, you have like a team of managers, and then under that you have a bunch of employees, right? Mm-hmm. And then you have like your staff or janitorial stuff or whatever maintenance. So if you think about a school, it's the same way. So the managerial class is like tenure track people. They have offices, they have benefits, they have all this stuff, right? They get releases, they get paid a living wage. The adjuncts, it's Obamacare. They limited how many classes we could get and how many hours we get to tutoring.
I gotta ask a question. I gotta ask a question. You don't know if Ted Kaczynski was an adjunct professor, do you? Or if he was a full day, if he got the benefits. I reckon he would have been. I reckon he would have had the hardship. I reckon that would have been part of it anyway.
Was he a professor? I know he.
I think he went back and he was before he went into the wild. I think that's what he was doing. I might be wrong because on occasion, quite a few occasions, I can be wrong. but that's what I seem to remember. So I'm sure someone will tell me at some point.
I haven't, I don't remember a lot of. I just remember, I remember, when I was a kid hearing the stories, and it's just like, there's a crazy guy that's like, putting mail bombs. I didn't know anything about his manifesto until, I don't know, maybe 10, 15 years ago. I was a kid. I was very young, so I probably wasn't paying attention. But, I wonder how much I wonder how much attention that actually got in the media. I know they published his manifesto in like New York Times or something.
They were getting used to doing that. They did that with the Zodiac Killer as well, and they did that with a few others where they started to publish bits, and it's like oh, it could be anybody. It kind of had to. I think it was purposely done. It kind of had the Jack the Ripper effect. Where you everybody wants a little bit of the limelight and everybody wants to know the story, so everybody speaks about it, and there's just no truth out there at all. Hard to discern because there's so many voices and they're all saying different stuff. But yeah, go on. Sorry.
Yeah. So so I don't. I fly below the radar, which is a good thing. So I've written this book, and it's not, it's not exactly the popular thing to say as far as in academia, right? I mean, they're all about all the public-private technology partnerships, especially post-COVID. I mean, it was just a rubber stamp session when I was able to get on the CARES committee as the adjunct representative. It was only because other people complained that there were no adjuncts on the committee, and I shared some insights into some of the legislation, and they were like, "Oh, you might be helpful or whatever." And it just, it took a lot of my time to sort of just spin my wheels. I mean, we were basically supposed to propose technologies for distance learning, and what I was trying to do was at least get more information about the proposals, because everybody was just sort of like, we need a simulator for dental tech. Didn't name the company, didn't have a description of what the data policy was, or privacy protections, didn't say anything about the efficacy. Did the technology do what it said it would do? It was just like, we got money, let's get technology, stamp. So, but it's as like university, I thought that it would be a cushier route than carpentry, and in some ways I've probably worked work more, certainly work more hours. I know that. Work way more hours than I would doing construction. I certainly make a lot less money because I got a lot of friends that, GEDs, they make more than I do doing construction, right? I mean, this is the nature of business as opposed to academia. And I got to say this because, I think about it a lot. For academia is probably the institutionally, right? It's probably the biggest cheerleader for Marxism or socialism or communism, all these different versions of that brand of economics. And they're always about, everybody's the exploited worker and the exploited minority and the exploited. They are the most exploitative institutions when it comes to their employees. I mean, the hypocrisy is out of this world. Like, first of all, as an adjunct, I've tried, like in one of the schools where I teach, it's in a neighborhood where I grew up, and I used to volunteer there before I became an adjunct. And when they had openings for, a full-time position, this is years ago, I stopped even trying. They've never even gotten an interview. And they always pick the person that's got the PhD. Some random person from afar that's got a PhD because, what it looks like in terms of their ethos and, the PhDs, has a greater ability to get grants, right, for grant, get grant monies and things like that. So, and by the way, it's at a community college. It's not at a university. It's not a four-year school, right? Like most of the people that are coming out of those schools are going to get a 2-year associate's degree, right? They don't necessarily need somebody that has PhD level specialization in a highly academic field, right? They need somebody that can give them the gen ed, right? So somebody with a master's degree that lived in that community, that volunteered at that place, you would think would at least get an interview, right? Like at least in corporations, like they actually tend to hire in-house, right? Because they don't have to train somebody new, right? You already know how we operate, right? We just need to sort of get you up to speed on these other tasks. Academia is the total opposite. So it's just like, for an institution to be, so vocal about, the exploited worker, and to promote that stuff, you would think that they would at least reflect it in their hiring policies. But that's a whole nother issue. So when I went to college, I basically just, tried to, stay out of trouble, get good grades, sort of regurgitate the lecture under the paper to make the professor happy. I was studying English, literature in particular, and then eventually, because like I said, I didn't rock the boat or anything for most of my undergrad. And so they paid for me to do an assistantship. And, it was during the Bush era that I was undergrad. And I kind of had looked around and, this was when I went through my own like Marxist kind of socialist phase because I didn't really have a background in kind of geopolitics or political science. And then, I was like, well, this Iraq war stuff is horrible. Like, and they're pushing all this Marxist critical theory in the schools, and it's like, oh, so these people are against the Bush stuff, right? The Iraq war stuff, what I saw as the capitalist stuff. So I was like, okay, I'm against that. So that means, I like this other team. And then when Obama got in and basically did the same thing in terms of foreign policy, and I started to point it out to the professors that I thought like were people with principle, right? That they would like call it out. And, no, what I learned was that they're not even ideologues. They're basically, I don't know if demagogue is the right word, but they're not against corporatism in principle. They just want to be in charge of the company.
They are not against corporatism in principle. They're against not being the person who the corporatists rely upon for all of their wisdom. That's what I feel that it's been like for 150 plus years. And when you were talking then, I was thinking about an article from years ago. I can't remember where it was in. It has to be in I think Los Angeles Times or something along those lines, but back in 1890. So I think about 1896. And it was an article written by Alice Ricks, a really big one. I covered it I read it all out during the Bohemian Grove episode in Newshound. And she describes the people who are members of the Bohemian Club. And this club that's been existing for 23 years and is growing in stature greatly. And so she goes and she interviews the idea of the three dynamics that exist within it. The owl, so the people of government, the people of power, the people who is meant to be wise, the bohemian, the actor, the entertainer, the vagabond and rogue, the singer, the charmer, the ones who need government, but they're not interested in that. They're doing arts and stuff, but they can't be relied on for anything. And then the people of the mortarboard. And the people of the mortarboard, of course, professors and university. And she talks about each of these and she describes them fantastically. And she talks about the people of the owl being very, we know exactly what we need to do. And the people of Bohemians being like, oh, well, I don't want to intrude, but I'll have a little bit of cake if you're offering to me. And, and it kind of like brings out the characters. But when she's talking about the people of the mortarboard, she described exactly what you're describing there. People who want to be a member of the big club that makes the rules because they're educated, they know everything, they're reading everything, they're learning everything, they're changing the world at this level down here, so they're more important than everybody else. Even though they can understand why the people in office do the things they do, they wouldn't do them if they talked to them. And the Bohemians, they can't do much, and they wouldn't be able to do any of that unless it was for the people of the mortarboard. So the people of the men of the mortarboard believe that they're the greatest in the world, and that they can do no wrong and make no wrong decision, is what Alice Ricks in the 1800s was expressing. And I think that's kind of what you describe there, if I'm not wrong.
Yeah, no, I mean, it comes directly out of Plato's Republic. It's as old as Plato's Republic, right? I mean, so his whole idea was that you would have philosopher kings that would rule. They would be the golden caste, and they would rule over the silver and bronze. And the silver would be basically the military, and the bronze was what they called the husbandmen and the basically the farmers and the cattle drivers and things like that. Right. And basically, for Plato, he thought that, this is where you get the term aristocracy, right? He thought that the best form of government, his republic would have been an aristocracy. The root aristos basically just means the best. So the best would rule. For him, the best were the wisest, and the wisest were the people that studied philosophy. And, you jump forward to late 1800s, early 1900s. And you have someone like Aldous Huxley, who, I've read his nonfiction essays. I've got all, 6 volumes of his nonfiction essays. And if you read his nonfiction essays and then you read Brave New World, there are several passages in which he talks very favorably about the eugenics and the behavioral conditioning and the Malthusian population control in Brave New World. In particular, there's an essay called a Note on Eugenics. There's one that's titled something like On the Future of the Past or something like that. I'm going to actually write a paper about this that is hopefully going to get published in an academic anthology that's going to get published come out of a conference in Poland that hopefully I'm going to be able to go to in September if there's not a hot war with Russia there. Yesterday I saw that there's something going on in Belarus where Poland's getting kind of antsy and Russia's kind of saying don't mess.
Expect that to continue. Expect that to continue round and round in a circle. The fact is that it'll still remain that the main targets or the main centers of all of these will be the same targets that the American intelligence infrastructure has been aiming at for ages, and that doesn't really include Poland. Poland is pretty safe, and it's usually just rhetoric backwards and forwards. Just my opinion. It's Belarus, Georgia, Ukraine, and probably one other. I can't remember which one's the other. The real ones that they really just, it's going to keep sparking off. So things will happen there, and they'll make comments around the region. But I think you'll be all right. Hopefully. Come on.
Yeah. Well, the way I looked at it was, I mean, some of it's like, you get a ticket, you don't get a refund on that. You know what I mean? So it's like, but then I'm thinking like, well, if something does go down in Poland, right? Like losing a plane ticket is probably not the worst of my worries at that point, right? And that probably means there's going to be some other really nasty geopolitical conflicts that are going to kick off, which are going to come along with all sorts of other draconian domestic policies here to make sure
there's no way that war kicks off in Poland against Russia and holy hell doesn't break loose. There's no way on earth. That's like strategically there's been there's also, you could go back to World War II and say, well, it was Poland where everything started to kick off, because Poland is so fundamentally important. So fundamentally important to the stability of Europe. Everybody knows it. So, and Russia's playing the same game as the West is playing. They're dancing around each other. It seems like maybe it's like a dance between like culture and sort of narcissistic ideology, really, like excessive culture on the one side, with Russia and culture being so rich, and there being an American sort of beast behind a lot of what's going on, that wanted to create a culture out of many other cultures and hasn't really done it, and is a bit soulless when it comes to interacting in the world. Wow, man. Yeah, go on.
Poland, I mean, what Carol Quigley calls the Balkans, or rather the buffer zone, which is the Balkans, basically always sort of been stuck in the middle between, Germany, France, and England in some combination or another, having beef with Russia, and then those countries basically getting stuck in the middle because they're sort of what we call the buffer fringe, right? So, they sort of almost very similar in some ways to, what some of the, Middle Eastern and African countries sort of get stuck into, which is like, you got Eastern Europe and Western Europe starting a fight in or around your country, and you're sort of like, well, whose side do you be on? It's like, I don't want to be on either side, but as the troops start marching in, I mean, they almost force them to be.
Yeah, well, of course you can. I mean, there's only a couple of countries that have ever been able to remain neutral during World War, and it's always for other reasons. Always for other convenient reasons for all sides. Switzerland is an example of that, but also is strategically. I mean, Switzerland can defend itself because it's mainly mountains all around, so it's only got to defend a little bit, and it's kind of like the 300 defending the breach or whatever. But also Spain, but both it was very, like, during World War II, it was very convenient for those countries to have neutrality, so that the war could continue on both sides. So it wasn't helpful in the way.
So I kind of went on a tangent. My point was that Aldous Huxley, he uses the term science. So scientific caste system, intellectual aristocracy. These are his terms that he uses in multiple essays. There was a radio recording he did on the BBC to promote his book when it came out. And if you look at the caste system, the eugenic caste system in Brave New World, the different castes, which he describes in terms of like phrenological terms, right? So he calls like some of the epsilons brachycephalic, right? And then there seems to be a racial hierarchy in his description, although it's not. There's some overlap there, right? It's not just right all the black and brown people at the bottom.
The best of each caste, like
there's every once in a while you get somebody that's of a different ethnic lineage in a different caste in when you read through the novel, but what he breaks it down into is basically he also uses the eugenic IQ terminology, so he refers to the epsilons as semi-morons. Okay, and the castes are alpha, delta, epsilon, etc. Right?
Is that where I am? It sounds about right. It sounds like I'm a probably
You are.
semi-moron. If I mean, according to Aldous Huxley, I would think semi-moron. I'm gonna find out that I'm a full-on moron, aren't I? I'm gonna
They would
find out. Come
probably
on.
they would probably think that we're all semi-morons. It was
Yeah.
Bertrand Russell that said something. This is sort of an interesting note. Is that he said something like, "Eventually, we'll get state policies where we can sterilize anybody that doesn't meet the basic school requirements." He literally says that. I want to say it's science, Impact of Science on Civilization or something like that. It's one of those books that he says it in, or Impact of Science on Society, something like that. And but he says, well, and it'll be good because we'll get rid of all the unfit, but we'll also lose a lot of good people too, because he said that clearly Charles Dickens's father, I guess the guy, I don't know if he's a drunk or something, but he apparently wasn't the best father according to Bertrand Russell. He says, we would have definitely sterilized him, right? And if we did that, we wouldn't have Charles Dickens, right? And if you think about people like Stephen Hawking or Beethoven, right, like people that have had defects, so to speak, that but yet nonetheless contributed.
I thought you were saying something bad about Beethoven's mum there.
I don't know anything about it.
That's what she said. Anyway, go on.
Well, it's India. I don't know why they use him as an example, because he wasn't congenitally deaf. I believe that developed.
Yeah.
But maybe there was a gene that showed that down the pipe he would have became deaf. But the point is, right? Like these were, because deafness was something that like Alexander Graham Bell, who was very much a proponent of eugenics, that was one of the things that they wanted to get rid of, right? This was always like the positive sort of pitch for it, right? Not just like, let's get rid of all these ethnic subpopulations, but it was like, well, we'll get rid of disease and mental illness and various forms of mental handicap, what they would have clinically called retardation back in the day, right? And the only thing with that is that you can't actually divorce the two to a certain degree, right? You know what I mean? Like if you don't accept the flaws of humanity, then you necessarily you might set the bar back here. Oh, we're just going to do deaf people, right? But eventually, once you do that, it's like, well, why not blind people too, and why not? And so if you use that as your ethic, as your axiology, I don't. Eventually, what you start pathologizing more and more attributes until you get down to some sort of mass manufactured sort of cookie cutter human that fits perfectly into whatever public-private partnership career pathway we have set for you. But again, all this goes back to Plato's Republic, and that's why Huxley uses the Greek letters to refer to the different caste systems. So,
how much weight? Because I'm going to be there's a lot of crossover within something that I'm working on. We're going to get to behind the scenes at some point about a load of this, because I'm working on something really amazing with a couple of other people, not a load of other people, but that's going to come out next year. That will include, obviously, will skirt along Huxley, both Huxleys, but I mean, you're obviously, he's a really easy way to show people how the elites think about race, how they think about gender, how they think about equality, how they think about us, how they think about the others. And it is something that people, if they understand it, then they can understand the dynamic of why they look down upon us, and maybe we don't get the same sort of benefits in life, and they're making this world. What do you think that they're being true to like an old vision, or are they just using bits of these sort of like thinkers, and where do you see it in the future? Because I can see what like people like Huxley envisioned. What do you think we're going to get to that's in that area, if that makes sense?
I mean, I think it's basically a blueprint. I mean, it's not just so the eugenics. I mean, I sort of ran through that. That's so the first chapter is all about setting the plot, providing the setting. And so what you have is you have a world government, or we call the world state. Okay, the motto is community, identity, stability. So you have this sort of collectivist, right, communitarian sort of ideology, and everybody in the world state is named after people who were foundational to the theories and ideas of the world state. So that would be the eugenicists and the behaviorists, and also the communists and the fascists, right? So what you have is, you have people like characters' names Bernard Marx. Oh, that's a combination of George Bernard Shaw, who's a Fabian socialist, and Karl Marx. You have Lenin a Crown, Lenin, right, being a play on Vladimir Lenin. And, I've looked at who the crowns refer to, and, I don't know. There's different theories. I'm not sure that it may or may not refer to the Crown family of Chicago or another Crown family out of Britain. But there's several, right, examples of communists, socialists, right, and then even the anarchists, right. There's a character that has the name Bakunin in it, and then but you also have basically the industrial mechanism of the world state. So the eugenics is mass produced through an assembly line and babies in bottles, and that whole assembly line is basically a symbol for what becomes their deity, which is Ford, right? So they say, instead of "Oh Lord" or "Our Lord," they say "Our Ford." Instead of making the sign of the cross, they make the sign of the T, right? Like a Model T. All right. So what you see is, right, what is he saying? You have a combination of, again, the sort of the corporatists, sort of fascist market or industrial economics with, again, the Marxist or the communist ethos. And there's, in one of his essays, he literally says that the fascist party in Italy, the communist party in Russia, and the Kuomintang in China are all imperfect versions of the perfect statecraft that will be the statecraft of the future. Right. So, and this is in his nonfiction essays, right? Mm-hmm. But he says there's going to be some sort of a caste system that's based largely on genetics. And in the realm of education, you can see something like there's a field called precision education that wants to personalize your learning based on your genetic IQ.
Sneaky.
And in the second chapter, it's all about behaviorism. It's all about how after they breed the babies in bottles, then they condition them, right? And so the lower castes go through a series of punishments to make them scared of nature and reading, basically. So they bring the babies out and they shock them and let off loud explosions when they get close to these roses and these books, so that they'll be scared of nature and reading, right? And so you combine those two and you get something like basically the modern social credit ESG scoring, right? So in other words, right, you have, based on your biometrics, based on your, not just your genetic biometrics, but all the various biometrics that they can data mine from a whole host of education technologies that range from adaptive learning courseware to biofeedback wearables. So if anybody's seen the videos in China, there's a Wall Street Journal video where a company called BrainCo puts these kids up to these halos that data mines their EEGs while they're doing their lessons, and then that puts them in a particular social score bracket, and that determines their access to the public square commercial services, everything from transportation, healthcare, education, workforce, housing, etc. Right? And so, combining, basically the eugenics and the behaviorism of chapter 1 and chapter 2, and then putting it through this system of AI data mining, you can basically put people into a caste system, right? Which is basically, and then which would be managed by this sort of corporate fascist, communitarian, communist world state, which we can see exemplified in something like the public-private stakeholder capitalism of the Great Reset of the World Economic Forum. So, in many ways, there's not much in the novel that hasn't actually gotten right up to the edge. I mean, other than ectogenesis, meaning like developing babies outside of the womb, I mean, other than that, there's not a whole lot in that novel that is that you don't even need to think of as science fiction, right? I mean, it's a slightly different iteration, but again, they didn't even have the double helix discovered back then. But the idea, right, this idea of bioengineering and psychological conditioning managed by a world government of big business and other bureaucracies is clearly something that is coming to fruition.
Yeah, I wonder how much of all of this was inspired, and all of this generation of people like Aldous Huxley and the like, or were inspired by India and the writings that came out of India from Western observers within India, because of course, especially British, because of course the British were constantly using Indian society. I mean, they took hold of Indian society in nearly every single level by taking control of the top level, and the way it was designed meant that they were in control of everything all of a sudden, and the systems was already fantastically similar to British systems that they tend to put in place anyway. So you had like the ability for them to take over the entire country within a decade or more, and exert their control easily. But then they studied India. I'm reading a lot of work, not only people like you read work like Rudyard Kipling, where he talks about time in India, but you talk about other people who were studying viruses. I'm looking at a guy called Reginald Farrar, who was out in India during the bubonic plague that was in the 1890s. And when you were talking, I thought about one book in particular that I read, and it was a book without any pictures called The Kama Sutra. I bought it. It was Richard Burton. So it was a guy who went over and basically went over to India back around that time and gave his understanding of all of the different parts of Indian society. And it's amazing. It's amazing. I think there was a lot of people studying the caste system within India and then relating it to their own existence within the hierarchies within Britain. And kind of like, if you look at some other societies, it is really easy to see why people think that eugenics could just be the norm, because it's actually practiced in different ways all around the world. And there's already some form of sort of nuance in different countries, including massive countries like India. So I sorry, that was a long question, but how much do you think that was influenced by India and people's like
in the same quote where well, one of the quotes, because there's many, but in one of the quotes where Aldous says that basically that we're gonna have a eugenics system, and it's going to basically create a caste system, and he says that that it will be the effect that the intellectual aristocracy will basically be a new kind of Brahmin, is literally the term that he uses, right? And then in the novel as well, so they have a world religion, okay, and the world religion it involves basically a psychedelic ritual and communal sex, and the psychedelic that they give them is something called soma. And the soma, I mean, there's a muscle relaxer called soma, but the original word can be traced back to a drug that's documented, I believe, the Vedas or the Bhagavad Gita. And this was nobody really knows exactly what it was or what it, what type of psychic effects it had. But that's where he gets that concept from. And one of the things that they, through that process, right? So they all take this soma, and it's sort of an inversion on the Christian Eucharist. But basically, they say I drink to the annihilation of self, right, and to the greater being, right? I mean, and that's very much comes out of the Hindu idea of moksha, right? That which is. So the best analogy is that, your Atman or your soul is like this shard or this fragment of the universe. And it's like, your body is like this glass jar or this vessel. And through meditation, that you could basically turn the cup over. So your jar is sitting in the ocean of the universe, and you turn the cup over, and then the spark, the drop of water that is your soul, sort of blends into the universe, which is God, right? Brahma, which is the three different godheads, Brahma and Shiva, and I think Vishnu is staying there. And so there's definitely a lot of Hindu mysticism that Huxley uses, at least to buttress his idea of how psychedelics will basically be used to placate or the populace, right? And he's also the guy, by the way, that he wrote he experimented quite a bit with psychedelics. He wrote the book The Doors of Perception, which is a play on a William Blake quote, but it's also where the band The Doors got the title for their band. And I've been thinking more about it lately because another thing that's promoted quite a bit in the realm of what's called social emotional learning. There's a whole they like to emphasize meditation for wellness. And I was thinking a lot more about meditation in martial arts, and a lot of it, the controlling of the breath is to manage your adrenaline and your emotions when you're in, a combat scenario, right? Because one of the things that for anybody that's competed before, you'll know that, if you can spar 10 rounds, doesn't mean you can do a five round in an actual, or a 5 minute round in an actual fight, because what happens is the adrenaline kicks you up. And I remember my first fight, people kept telling me, like, you're not running enough, you're not doing enough cardio. And I'm thinking, like, well, I feel good when I'm sparring. Yeah, but your adrenaline isn't that high up, right? And so the first fight I had was miserable because I pretty much ran out of. I won a unanimous decision. It's funny because, like, I thought I was getting beat up the whole time because I was so out of gas. So when I'm like, the fight's over and they say my name, and I go, ah! I like look up, I won. But it was an experience because, I didn't realize, what your mind does in that situation. So some of that is, you can prevent that by, have a very large gas tank in terms of your cardio. But another thing that especially in the East that they learned was, well, you can actually control a lot of that with your breathing, because it's not just that, right? The adrenaline starts to, dump you full of epinephrine and everything, but you start to, the breath, everything gets worked up. So if you can sort of, right, detach from what's happening and just sort of let things happen, let your training sort of take over, let your reflexes take over. Mm-hmm. But there was a more sinister application, and that was that, if you were like the samurai back in the day and you're slicing people up all the time, right? Like, just like anybody that has to go to war, a lot of trauma that happens from that, right? So you gotta go home and you have to think about, right, the component or power that's invading. I mean, the act of basically slaughtering people had this traumatic effect on people. So when you hear a lot of the Zen masters say stuff like, I don't cut, the cut, the sword does the cutting, it cuts itself, right? You sort of detach yourself from the act, and some of that you can think of it as it's sort of the higher level of application, right? Like no-mindedness, right? Some of the best techniques are when it's like it just sort of happens. You're like, whoa, you're sparring. That was good, man. What'd you do there? And you're like, I don't know. Maybe you think back over, oh, you did this, and then I did that, because the body takes over, right? But the other part of that is that if you can detach yourself from the act, right, that can help you to that can sort of create the necessary cognitive dissonance to keep going to war, right? So if you apply that to, like, right, you're in this school and they're pumping your head full of this crazy woke brainwashing stuff, right? You start to have this cognitive dissonance, right? And you're constantly being monitored by all these devices. And so you're right? You're going to be constantly on edge. You're going to be constantly off kilter. You're going to be constantly confused, right? Knowing that you have to follow these orders in order to get your social credit score to a certain level. That the meditation apps, which come along with the wearables, right? So you'll basically put something like a heart math wearable on, and then you'll do your breathing meditation. So you get yourself in what they call heart coherence, and that can basically put you in sort of a detached state that sort of gives you some psychological or neurological respite from the constant destabilization, confusion, and data mining, right? So I mean, again, right, this idea of de-individuation, through for the sake of blending with the collective, but for someone like Huxley and Schwab, yeah, well, it won't be, it's not going to be, to attain some higher collective, right? With the public-private communitarian collective, right?
Yeah, but I, as you were speaking there, every single thing you've been saying for the past, since we were talking about Aldous Huxley and throughout that, I know that we've been moving towards talking about Babs, Barbara, and transhumanism, and I mean, she's such an interesting figure, and what you were saying there, the preparation. And using Indian philosophy in the same way, using loads of different ways to detach us from our own individuality. There is nothing that's so emblematic of that than late stage transhumanist policy. We could say, it feels funny to say it like that because it's so extreme what some people envision in the future. And these people, of course, are the next generation. That she is someone who's the next generation from Aldous Huxley. So give us a little bit of a rundown on her for the people who don't know who she is.
Yeah, so Barbara Marx Hubbard, very influential in the New Age movement. She was promoted to be a candidate for vice president. Walter Mondale's vice president when he ran against Reagan. She comes from a very wealthy family, the Marx Toys fortune. She's an heir to the Marx Toys fortune. Louis Marx, her father, was buddies with J. Edgar Hoover and President Eisenhower. She met with Eisenhower at one point, and asked him, all this technology that we're sort of developing, this is like the post-nuclear era. Like, what good can we do with it? And she says he didn't give him a very good answer. So then it became sort of her life's journey to figure out how to use technological evolution towards, the betterment of the species instead of, sort of like nuclear annihilation. And so for her, those technologies basically take the form of what become these various transhumanists, everything from the wearables to the implantables. And she thought that this would be the way to prevent not just nuclear holocaust, but also environmental catastrophe, the Malthusian catastrophe. So she was similar to Herman Kahn in that way. And I think, pretty sure, if my memory serves me correctly, that Herman Kahn was also a member of the World Future Society, which was founded by Barbara Marx Hubbard. And so what you had was the futurists, they agreed largely with people like Aurelio Peccei, and Barbara Marx Hubbard did speak with Aurelio Peccei. She also was connected to Maurice Strong and Mikhail Gorbachev. Maurice Strong was the guy that set up the United Nations Environmental
Massively important for people who don't know who Maurice Strong is. Go and study Maurice Strong and then realize why we have environmentalism. Anyway, go on, sorry.
No, he comes out of that same period that we started with in that 70s. So it was 72, I think that, so 72 was the year that he set up the UN, the UNCHE, UNCHE, so it's United Nations Conference on the Human Environment. That's what, out of that came the UNEP, United Nations Environmental Program. That's 1972. That's the same exact year that the Club of Rome published Limits to Growth, okay? And then 20 years later to the date was the year that they published the sequel to Limits to Growth, which is Beyond the Limits, and that's also 92 is the exact same year that Marie Strong headed up the Rio Conference, environmental conference for the United Nations, and that's where you get UN Agenda 21, and basically the development goals come out of that as well. And obviously when it becomes Agenda 2030, SDGs that drive the Great Reset today. And so Hubbard was connected to all these people. Strong was also part of this thing called the State of the World Forum that Hubbard was also a part of. And she was, that was set up by Gorbachev. Strong and Gorbachev both set up something called Earth Charter, which was a combination of Gorbachev's Green Cross International and Strong's Earth Council or Earth Charter. It's one or the other. And interestingly, it was the person that put those two together that connected Strong and Gorbachev was Queen Beatrix of the Netherlands, right? Who was a member of the Bilderberg Group, and it's I think it's her father is Bernhard, Prince Bernhard. He's the guy that founded the Bilderberg Group, and he actually was the honorary sponsor of that third annual WEF forum where the Limits to Growth and the Stakeholder Capitalism Project were pitched to the World Economic Forum. So she's so Hubbard was connected to that whole Malthusian crowd, but she and other futurists like Kahn, they had more of an idea. They were not quite as hardcore Malthusianists in the sense that they felt like that growth did not need to be limited quite as much as somebody like Petchy. Meaning they thought that if they could develop, certain technologies, especially space technologies that could potentially bring us off world, but also other technologies like green technologies or other sorts of bioengineering technologies that could enable the human species to be more efficient with their consumption of natural resources and all this stuff, that we could continue to grow in these ways while only curtailing human population and
For people who want to read up on this, a good way to see the change is first of all to have a look into Herman Kahn's Year 2000 that was written in like 67, 68 that looked at all of the future technologies that were to come, and then his update after Aurelio Pecci and Club of Rome, and he had his spat, and they were like, oh, if we can get and mine meteorites and go to Mars, then we don't have any limits to our growth at all. We could spread out all across the universe and be all powerful. But he spread a much more optimistic, and he a tone then in the mid 70s, and to update his Year 2000 he created the next 200 years. He wrote the next 200 years. So for people who want to read and see sort of like that sort of pro I don't know, neo-Malthusian, but positive sort of neo-Malthusian sort of perspective during that period. That's a really good, like, two documents to have a look at to see how they're juxtaposed. It's a really interesting time. So anyway, Barbara Marx Hubbard to these guys. Go, I hope I didn't interrupt you too much there.
No, you're good. Yeah. And then, so that was, and then so she, for her, this futurist project to sort of avert Malthusian catastrophe was not just a transhumanist project, but for her it's what she calls conscious evolution. For her it's basic. There's a spiritual component to it, right? And so she borrows this idea of noetic evolution, or this idea of the noosphere from this Jesuit priest who was also a eugenicist. His name was Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, and he basically had this idea that there was a noosphere, right? And the term noosphere comes from the root nous, and nous was Anaxagoras' idea. He was a pre-Socratic philosopher. The pre-Socratics all had different ideas about what was the fundamental essence or the basic unit of existence of the universe. And somebody like Thales thought it was water, other guys thought it was fire and earth and then eventually you had more sophisticated ideas like Heraclitus, who said it was the logos, or and Anaxagoras, who said that it was the nous, which basically was the mind, right? The mind of God, right? Or the intellect of the universe. And so the noosphere
is that kind of like, does that come from Gnosticism? Like, is that where the term comes from? Because like that's of course my understanding of basic Gnosticism is that there's a knowing boar smoking a pipe that created the universe, and the real God is behind and doesn't know it exists, and etc. Is that kind of from that?
It does, yeah. So the Gnostic stuff would come out later, and there's people argue about what is Gnosticism, because it's a broad spectrum of
definitely
different stuff, right? But and some of it doesn't necessarily agree with others. So your Sethians or your Valentinians, right, might not agree on certain things. But if you wanted to boil it down to the core, what most of Gnostic philosophies have at the core is a thread of Neoplatonism. And so the Neoplatonism is where you would get sort of a reiteration of sort of the concept of the logos in the nous, and this idea of that the demiurge being this lesser god that basically created matter and imprisons us.
That's who I was talking about. Yeah, the demiurge.
Yeah. Right. So for someone like Desjardins, there's a process by which the noosphere, the universe becomes conscious of itself, or the noosphere becomes conscious of itself through our consciousness, right? So basically everything has a certain consciousness or intellect in this paradigm, but the apex of that would be the human mind, human consciousness, right, which has self-awareness and agency in ways that the rest of matter and energy doesn't. And that and the pinnacle of our own human intellect is expressed through our ability to manipulate matter and energy through our technology. So the technology becomes sort of the icon or the idol of the noosphere that's manifest and expressed through the human mind. And so through the development of technology, right, the noosphere evolved from this sort of this permeating energy to a conscious mind or an agency to back into an artifact or material artifact that enhances our own human mind. And then at that point, we can sort of interface with that technology in a way in which, right, the collective noosphere through a collective cybernetic, through an Internet of Things managed by a super AI would sort of culminate in the final apex of noetic evolution. So for her, right, the evolution of technology is an extension of this, and our merger with it will basically be humanity 2.0, right? And so in that regard, right, and it will enable us, in her theory, to transcend matter and energy, not just in terms of like space travel and stuff like that, but if you start thinking of stuff like VR and AR, there's a whole movement that she sort of inspired or definitely influenced, called the Hollow movement, and that also is inspired by, I forget the guy's first name. His last name's Bohm. He was a physicist, and he had sort of theosophical leanings himself. But he's sort of the guy that sort of starts to popularize this idea of quantum reality, right? And so what you get to is you can, in the same way that the Gnostics wanted to break out of the physical prison of matter and energy, they would have been through more stuff like transcendental meditation or psychedelics or asceticism or whatever it is. But now through these technologies, we can sort of get out of this prison and into this virtual world that can be entirely of your own making and your own creation, right? So you could go into a sort of a metaverse where you could basically, like do Minecraft or a Roblox type of, basically build your own little space to live in. You could be whatever you want in terms of your avatar, right? So you don't have to be, I don't have to be 155 pounds, Polish American guy, right? I could be Frosty the Snowman and tall as a skyscraper, and right. And so you can basically, in that sense, transcend this prison, and what they say is become your own god, basically. And so that's how her idea of transhumanist evolution sort of dovetails with this Gnostic concept. And as you mentioned, this whole idea of dissociating the human individual from his or her own consciousness, his or her own soul. It really dovetails also with the whole trans movement, in the sense that this concept of that your identity is entirely subjective, that it's not that your identity is grounded in, right, your biology and your in the material world, but rather, right, that your biology is somehow secondary or an extension of however you identify. And so if you can identify as, right, a different gender, why can't you identify as a totally different creature in this avatar? And ultimately what you get to is a place in which your virtual avatar, or your virtual representation, another way to say it, is the data that sort of is aggregated to represent you in virtual space, becomes just as real as becomes just as much the core of your identity as, right, the physical you, right? And so obviously that leads to basically identifying more with your virtual identity, your virtual existence, which dissociates you more and more from your own human physical reality, your physical identity in the real world, human interaction.
Yeah, meta civil rights movement on its way. We got something crazy happening in the world right now, and that crossover is obviously linked. In my opinion, there's a dehumanization going on, a process where we're becoming digital, or certain parts of society are deciding to go that way. And they haven't really, I mean, loads of people don't think about the path they walk. They're often led down that direction, and things manifest in front of them, and they tackle them one at a time. So people aren't really looking at the long term. They're not really thinking, oh, what does this mean if I have this implant or this implant or this implant? Well, eventually it means you can be turned off really easily, or you're going to have things blow up in your head, or eventually it won't even be implants like you think. It won't even be microchips. It'll be fluids that you won't even know what they're doing, who's in control, and what's going on anymore. But it'd be a fantastic way to create a drone society. And of course, I mean, the vision that I've been painted of is at like the end game of a load of consciousnesses in some massive jar, really, all experiencing this sort of like reality that they think is reality, but all having this, beautiful feeling of complete peace. They don't have any pain anymore. They don't have physical bodies. They don't have all of these things. So I'm not sure if physical bodies continues with what they want to do, because what they want to do is, like, as soon as you've uploaded to something that is much more complicated and we can't understand the technology behind yet, but it will always exist. I mean, imagine it like a construct that is working on really advanced AI. This is possible. It's possible, but it means that there's going to be a battle someday between the future that people like Barbara Marx Hubbard was envisioning and the future that we're going to actually have, so how long do you think? Because when we sat down, and I already knew this, I thought we were going to have this sort of conversation, but I did note down a load of questions just in case that I needed some sort of like, direction here or there. And of course we don't need to, because everything you're saying, it makes sense, but it also like, there's lots of other questions that come automatically from it. And I suppose coming up to the end now, the one big question is what does our certain things, what does our educational system look like in 2040 or 2050? Not 10 years down the line. There's not much going to be, there's going to be lots of policy incorporated into society over the up until 2030, but then things are going to start to lift off, and there's going to be, if this all goes as planned, I really want to understand what you think education will look like, and what direction you think things like the trans movement will be going. Is there another movement that we haven't expected yet, or we haven't seen coming yet?
Well, I think that 10 years, stuff is moving fast, right? Like 10 years might be worse than what I could think of at the rate that we're moving, right? It's funny, I was did an Opperman, I was on the Opperman report, I want to say January 2020, and he asked me something to the effect of, when I was explaining how all the different technologies are going to data mine students and it's going to feed into a social credit database, and he says, well, how long are we looking? And I said, well, the people like Kurzweil say sometime between 2030 and 2045 is going to be a singularity. So that's roughly the date I would plan for when all this stuff sort of comes to fruition. But then I said, because we were also talking about the order of skull and bones and the Hegelian dialectic, and using artificial crisis creation problems, reaction solutions, basically create some sort of catastrophe or crisis that pushes people into these solutions more quickly. And so I said, but the right crisis could make things happen a lot quicker. And 2 months later was lockdowns, right? So so I mean, I thought I had 10 years before we even got as far as we were, when I said that day. But using a rough timeline, I would say that the end game is so when we get to that social credit system, basically where education begins in business or healthcare or mental health or job training or any of these other aspects or pillars of society would begin and end, it becomes indistinguishable, right? It just becomes all part of the same sort of algorithm, for lack of a better term, right? And that was kind of what I had surmised as I was writing the book, because I started to see how some of these devices were originally going to be pitched to help with various learning disabilities. But then I'm looking at it and going, well, okay, but that's a medical thing, right? So if you're talking about a medical technology or a medical policy, that's going to be under HIPAA. It's not going to be under FERPA. HIPAA is basically the laws that regulate healthcare privacy in the United States. FERPA regulates educational data privacy, right? So those are like two different laws, two different jurisdictions, so to speak. And so I was looking at it going like, well, how? I was like, they're going to have to slowly carve away at these laws and rewrite them in ways, right, to make them all sort of work together. Well, with emergency lockdowns, they didn't have to do that, right? They basically immediately just, it's all emergency, right? So, like, for me to get into the school building, you have to have a vaccination record, right? So now my healthcare status is going to determine whether or not I can get an education, which is obviously going to determine whether or not I can get a job, right? And now, if you're a conspiracy theorist, if you don't believe in COVID, right, you might be labeled a terrorist as well. So there's the criminal justice aspect, right? And so at a certain point, basically, all these technologies come into your home. The school building itself is going to be what's largely called a community center. So you might go there to do a lab or to do some other sort of internship or something that might require you to operate some machinery, or some other face-to-face interactions. But the bulk of your training, your education is going to be done at home on some device. You'll have a wearable on. I actually saw on Jimmy Dore not too long ago. They're pitching the same technology for the workforce, meaning the wearables. They call it boss wear, right? So your boss is going to watch and see, are you, based on your EEGs, are you on Facebook? Are you paying attention? Are you actually doing your work, right? So you'll be sitting at home doing your remote work, doing your remote training with your wearables on. And that'll be, in real time tracking your social credit score, and that'll all determine whether or not, you get your health care, you get your, whether or not a mental health counselor with under the auspices of the police, community-oriented policing, knocks on your door. And that'll be the education system. And it'll basically be a pipeline straight into whatever job, whatever career pathway they've determined based on your algorithms. In a large portion of the training, though, is actually going to be it's really character training, or in other words, right? It's not so much, because most of the jobs are going to be more or less automated, right? The skills you're going to need are going to be, basically how to operate a particular app, right? Or to know which buttons to click on to make the algorithm run efficiently. So you don't actually need a whole lot of, highly skilled training. But what you do need is, you need to be congenial to corporate culture, which is, right, in other words, you need to, you can't hurt the company's ESG score, right? So you have to, use all the right pronouns and use all the right equity phrases and avoid your microaggressions. And so most of your training will be geared towards that. As far as how the trans thing sort of drives another agenda, and I've sort of already alluded to the whole transhumanist thing, right? Because if there's no biological basis to your identity, there's nothing that makes you a man or a woman, then what's the difference between you and any other form of matter and energy, right? What's the difference between you and a microchip? What's the difference between you and a computer, right? Like where's the line to be drawn, right? And so with that, with the rise of these, GPT style AI, the next thing we'll see is a push, not just for, so we're seeing this expansion of rights, identity-based rights, personhood rights will be applied to the GPT AI, right? These various AI, right? So they'll be, next thing will be that they are given political rights or civil rights. And then at that point, somebody like Musk would say that, right, once the AI is sophisticated enough to give it rights, right, you'll basically have to merge with it. And this is why he's building his Neuralink. And what it will basically be is, the way I see it is, sort of like, that's all it really is, right? GPT, it's basically just a form of Google that can give you some form of analysis rather than just description. And so in some ways, it basically runs on the same type of auto population that, your text messages or your Gmail works on, right? So you start with one thing and it knows how to fill it in. So to merge with that type of AI would look something like, and this could be promoted as an assistive technology for people with learning disabilities, right? So if you have a hard time reading, you'll have a GPT, a little social emotional learning robot. I actually did a video recently on a robot called Moxie that is developed by in partnership with Pixar and Jim Henson Studios. It's funded by several World Economic Forum partners or corporations that are partners with the World Economic Forum. And it data mines your kids' facial expressions and all this, and it's supposed to help them parse their emotions. But something like this, you could basically, through your wearable, if you're trying to think of the answer to the test, right? Instead of having to say, Alexa, or whatever your name of your AI, Moxie, help me in asking the question, it'll just sort of be embedded in there, right? And so as you're thinking one thought, right, it'll intrude. It'll offer you, do you want to think this? Or do you want to think that? And, at that point, It's sort of like what you said about like, so what is this thing? What does this look like, right? Like the more you do that, at a certain point, right? The intrusive auto population into your own thoughts. At some point, right? I mean, if you think of it like a pie, right? Maybe it's like mostly you thinking, and then this thing suggests some stuff here and there, and then maybe depending on where you're at cognitively or how much you want to rely on it, right? Maybe that pie gets smaller, right? Maybe it's half your thoughts and half of that, right? So at some point, and this is totally speculation here. I mean, I don't know how far that goes, but obviously, if it goes past, the 50% mark, where most of the thoughts that you have, most of the inner monologue that you hear is actually computer generated through a wearable, right? Like the very notion of consciousness itself almost becomes obsolete, right? It basically becomes sort of like a sort of an antiquarian superstition, right? And then at that point, remember that it's not like you have an AI and I have an AI and your AI tells you things and my AI tells me things. That's all the same AI, right? It's just different devices, right? So then what you're saying is then, right, if you have a broad enough population, right? I don't know, let's just say most of the population has one of those things. And most of the population is using less than 50% of your own self-generated thoughts, right? Like at this point, you pretty much have something like a hive mind, right? I mean, and I don't know that, and this is where I started to wonder. So, when they say that they're going to become gods, I don't think they necessarily mean us, and I don't think they're going to I don't think they'll be using those things the same way. I think they'll be able to sit and look at sort of a AI supercomputer that sort of aggregates all of that, and the rest of us, it's sort of like a beehive, which they always, right? I mean, if you go back to some of the ancients that were, the Romans, they always loved beehives for that reason, right? Because you had this queen bee, you had this one, right, this master creature, and all these other little things. All they do is facilitate life around, right, this sort of this mother brain, right? And so you would have something to that effect would be my best guess at what that looks like when we go that far down the pipe. But knowing what I can speculate about it, I would, if I was them, I would guess that I would not have any intention to be plugged into that thing, right? That everybody else would be plugged in for the purposes of making them more compliant and subservient.
Yeah. Wow. There's so much there. So much there. It makes me think of something, whether, and this is more trickery from them, or whether this makes sense, but a lot of our brain, the decisions we make, the decisions be made in our brain before we even think we have like a conscious effort to make that decision. Our brain's already made the decision, and we enter into our conscious, and it's told what to think by that subconscious brain, and that manifests in all different sorts of parts of life, not just one or two, not just in decision making, but every single part of life. So it asks two questions. Or one main question, which is maybe, or possibly, if we look at it, then we're already not making the decision ourselves, and that we are already of this evolution, that somewhere back down the line, something from elsewhere has populated this planet within a way that leads to us and this whole thing. And that we are just, in a sense, pre-programmed, and we already respond to something that we don't have a sense of, an actual general sense of, of it happening. We respond in feelings and impulses and emotions that seem to come from elsewhere. So it's really interesting to wonder whether or not there's something more to all of this, or it's just simply humans who are trying to head towards a future that would then make more to all of this, because we're always trying to like become better. And yeah, like you say, there's probably going to be multiple tiers to any society that these malevolent creatures create. Listen, you've given me loads of time here, and I'm sure people are going to be just like, some of that is mind-blowing stuff. It's just thinking about transhumanism, thinking about the current state we're in, how the road we're going towards and where it leads is just, it's the thing that I think brings people out of the bubble. It bursts people's bubble if they're willing to listen to it. And I know that you'll find in your educational establishments or elsewhere that there's only a couple of people around who are willing to listen to it when you get up into the places of the mortar board, the owl, and the like. But humans who want to find out more, where they're going to find out more about your work and what you've researched, where can people find you?
Schoolworldorder.info. It's got all my social media. It's got my Twitter and my YouTube and my BitChute. I don't produce as much as I'd like to these days. Actually, it's just busier and busier. And as I mentioned, I'm an adjunct, not my day job. But School World Order is the main hub. Like I said, you can get everything there. There's links to my book, so that's the main place to go.
Yes, Googled all info, and there's all of these things are gonna be in the description. God, John, thank you so much. I mean, we're going to talk loads throughout our life, hopefully, and we're going to have discussions about all of these things, and maybe we'll even get to some sort of resolution one day. But I know that we've had conversations before in the past, privately, behind closed doors, about maybe being able to talk to the other side eventually about this, because there is another side to this story, isn't there? And we can come to our assumptions of why we think people are going towards this sort of transhumanist future. But until we bring those other people into the conversation, we're not going to really know why that manifests, or whether or not they're right, or whether or not we're right or wrong, or who's right or wrong. Anyway, I really thank you for your time, and keep up the good work. We can speak soon, I'm sure.
Right on, man. Glad to be here.